So I'm delighted to be here, and fair play to Limerick City and County Council and the National Biodiversity Centre and Una's team for organising it. I think it's been a great event. I've learned lots, and it's been great to catch up with people and meet new people. I'm going to talk about this. I'm going to try and do this quite quickly because I know we're all tired. And Hans was talking about, what they want to do ideally in increasing biodiversity in estates. And I started looking at this with Clúid. And Clúid, I'll give you an overview of Clúid first. They are the country's largest approved housing body. We're close to 10,000 homes. We're nationwide, and there's over 25,000 people living in those homes. We have a particular arm of Clúid called Clúid, which is housing for older people. And that's it's operated and kind of managed quite differently than the general needs housing schemes. So about 40% roughly are apartments, and the remainder, are kind of homes normally in housing estates. So I'm the first of my kind as an environmental scientist to be employed by an AHB or an approved housing body, which is great. The Clúid have a very strong greening strategy or sustainability strategy that I'm implementing. And you can see there's three main strands. There's build green. We're looking at everything from embodied carbon to retrofit to our infrastructure. The next one is live green, which is looking at our green spaces, green facilities, engaging our tenants to live sustainably also. And then be green is about our behaviour as an organisation itself. So the biodiversity straddles the build and live. And it became, I suppose, very apparent that there's a huge need for it. The scene of these housing schemes, they're years apart. That was a fairly decent one, a few years ago it was, there were a few trees there. You'd expect a few jumpers as goalposts maybe to be on the green, the kids would play. And the one on the kind of latest one is a Clúid, or it's Clúid, I'm not too sure if it's Clúid, I think it might be Clúid, or development in Ireland. And look, it's not a hell of a lot better. So there are housing schemes up and down the country like this, and we want to do better. The two images here, diagonally, are Clúid schemes. There is a general move to improve it, which is great, but we want to take it further. And I suppose what was interesting is we want, and this was mentioned earlier and really interesting to hear, and we absolutely see it in Clúid, is that correlation between you engage kids at a young age in their environment and the environmental actions, the positive environmental actions follow through. We're really aware that an awful lot of children especially, never mind adults, in housing estates and urban developments don't get to engage with environment. And we had spent 23 million on a regeneration project in the northeast inner city. I just started with Clúid, and the CEO said, what do you think? It was fabulous. Just behind the Gresham Hotel in O'Connell Street, this was a really, really shocking, flat complex. And they did an amazing job, A2 rated, 200 photovoltaics on the roof. It was really great. And the planting was awful. I said, it's probably going to fail really quickly. You've got stuff that's planted and it doesn't match antisocial behaviour. It's going to lend itself to a bit of that. And sure enough, very quickly, it failed. And it gave me the first insight into how landscaping was viewed in full stop in residential developments. And it's usually an afterthought. So you're spending 23 million, and at the last minute, they're cobbling together a plan to just lash it in, plant it out. Minister's going to launch this really soon. We got to get it looking okay. And it will look okay. It will look okay for a short period of time. So it became very, very, evident quite quickly we needed to look at this, and we needed to look at it for our new schemes and for existing schemes. And we needed to look at all elements, which, climate action, infrastructure management and community, they had to be part of this. So I suppose it was a really, really, really interesting learning curve. Obviously, you know, particularly for me, I wanted to bring in as much biodiversity into a meaningful plan. And I contacted Una, and she, you know, it became clear that there really wasn't a design guide in the country for, you know, for this purpose. And it just really was, I wouldn't say, it was a little bit shocking, because there's a number of departments that you're dealing with you know, in an organisation like Clúid, and they're all focused, as in a local authority, they're all focused on their remit. There's a housing crisis. We need to house people. We need to you know, we need to meet our remit, which is great. And I think everybody is well-meaning. They really are. Most people are well-meaning. Most people want to do the best they can. But the knowledge gap was really stark. And even when I said, look, can you ask the landscaping contractor to make sure X amount of planting is native and pollinators and yada, 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 they said, yeah, we can ask, but seriously, it's not really going to happen. And we have a team of architects who also said, look, it won't happen unless it's really, really, really clear, unless that we can stand over it and say, we set this out for you to do and you didn't do it. That's the only way we're going to be able to control this. And there's lots of stakeholders and actors, both within an organisation and obviously outside it. And they all have different agendas. And that was really interesting. We were about to launch a scheme very soon, and it's the first cost rental outside of Dublin. And it will attract quite a bit of attention, and the Taoiseach will open it. And the developer, we went in and said, look, can we create some more biodiversity here? What can we do? And he said, yeah, well, we'll look at it. And what we did was, about 6 months ago, hired a super horticulturist, and that was brilliant to also have her view on this as well, because she was coming from a totally different angle. And we chatted to the developers, and they said, oh, you know, it's going to look messy, and, you know, it needs to look good, and there's cameras coming, and, you know, Taoiseach's coming, but it was that perception of this is going to look. Now, we reached a great compromise, and hopefully shifted their attitudes and you know, how they're developing out their green spaces. And in fact, a few weeks later, he asked, could he borrow Ingrid's, the horticulturist designs for another scheme, which is brilliant. So bit by bit, you've influence. So the support, and this is really important, the support for anything needs to come from the top. In our case in Clúid, and Aoife Munn has been mentioned a number of times, the CEO did a course with Aoife Munn and was absolutely hell-bent that he was going to improve biodiversity as much as he could within our organisation. So as I kind of touched on there, it became really, really clear that we needed to detail everything, and we needed to educate while we're detailing it. So what we have included are these design guides. So they're design guides for building. So everything will be spec'd from a property. The handles on doors in a kitchen will be spec'd, everything. And we pretty much have, that's what we've gone about producing. What started off as a small plan, you know, to maybe give developers, has now developed into probably, will end up at about a 60-page, fairly detailed guide that we will stand over and say, you know what, you didn't miss, or you had missed this X, Y, and Z in it. So we detailed out in pre-planning everything from habitat surveys, asking do they conduct a tree survey, hedgerow survey, route protection zones, level surveys, have they looked at SUDs, that they consulted with the current local authority biodiversity plan, that how have they assessed the existing boundary structures, can they be retained, for example, dry walls, so on and so forth. But we've had to explain why, because the knowledge gap is real. And unless they understand why, sure, you know, it doesn't really have the same impact. And then we looked at design actions, looking at, and I know Hans was talking about hedgerows and the issues with them, but look, they're fundamental to most of the planning regs as well. But looking how we can look at SUDS plans to incorporate a planting regime, to look at making sure that wildlife corridors and connections are in place, again, the boundary types and really protecting what's there in the first instance. So key to this is visuals and explanations, and we've put these in all over this guide. So you're detailing at every point, you're explaining. So this is quite typical. This is really typical of housing estates and what goes in, and we want to try and change that up. We want to put in pathways for hedgehogs, for example. And when we're looking at, concrete capping or blocks and so on, we want to try and create nesting blocks and look at more potential for nesting for invertebrates and this for the bottom one, the solitary bees. But again, you're explaining here that this is much better because it allows free movement than something that's not going to allow free movement. You will very well plant a hedge, and behind that and create an additional boundary, but it creates that movement. But unless those details aren't given, it will not happen. So I just wanted to touch on this, and then Hans basically said he'd rip out every hedgerow. But they are the most valuable boundary. And this is something that was quite interesting for me. I mentioned, look, we have to work on this. And the attitude was, well, but sure, nobody asks about hedgerows. They're not important. So there's a bit of work there, and I'll talk about it in a little bit from the local authorities' perspective. So to run through this, the main elements of I suppose, landscape infrastructure was looked at. And if we don't have the fundamentals right, then we're just struggling and struggling and struggling forevermore. And that's particularly in terms of soil. The soil quality that we're getting on schemes is really poor. And you're just limited in what you can do from that point on. So we have put in standards, and we've put in the threat to inspect and make sure that they meet those standards. We are really mindful that we need to work with the industry, that we can't alienate the industry and they think, God, it's going to become really cumbersome. So we're really open to kind of bringing them along and working with them. But things like green roof systems and being able to reference what other local authorities are doing in this space, actually, it gives leverage to what we're asking, and that's really important. And look, there's loads of guides from, trees, planting, looking at locations and aspects and timeframes and all of this. And I mentioned it earlier, we want to try and influence, if we dictate too much, we're going to turn people off from working with us, which we're really aware of. So we've put in some gold standards that we would love to see. Again, I can't imagine this happening this year, but in future years to come, it hopefully will become more standard as it develops. And we really need to design for people, and we're all about people. If we don't design for people, then it's not going to be engaged with at all. And what was happening on schemes, if you said to a developer, will you put in something like a growing area? And they might be doing this for their own kind of ESG policies and their own blurb on what they're doing, but they would choose a really poor piece of ground all the way back in the development that nobody can get to, or it's going to be a trudge for people, especially older people, to get to. So we want to look at how an area is planned out, make sure this, play areas are really important. It can't impinge on play areas, but look at universal design, that it can develop in a state as it matures. And that point of kind of trying to engage people of all mobilities and abilities is really, really central to this as well. So I'm going to touch on this for a second. When I first started looking at this, the surprise that hedgerows would be important. I mean, it might be there as a line in a planning, but unless it's enforced, unless it's really, something that the local authorities, or it will come up in a planning discussion, and the more developers see that as important, the more it will be treated as important. We've discussed a little bit about lighting, and Kevin showed an image earlier, and it was in terms of swapping out traditional lighting for LEDs in terms of climate action. And what that's doing is there's been, I think it was University of Newcastle, so there was a decline of 50% in insects, and then you've got the knock-on impacts from that, because the white, blue, bright light is causing havoc. So while all of this retrofit of public lighting is underway, it'd be great to even have a filter in there to mitigate that. Okay. I'm going to touch on this really quickly. The maintenance is really important for us, because obviously those schemes stay with us for forever. And it's really important that we educate and the residents as well. And it's really important that we bring people with us. So from the get-go, design and how we'll be looking after those spaces and developing them, ensuring them, has to be considered. And that education piece is not just for residents, it's for all the staff. We've given workshops to all of the kind of housing staff, as well as the property services staff, as the new business who are in charge of developing out the properties. It's really important that everybody is aware, and that sometimes is missed in large organisations. That's it. I promised I'd finish before my 20 minutes, so hopefully that was okay.